It wasn't just a new plane. It was total air dominance. The moment I strapped myself into that F6F Hellcat for the first time, I knew the Japanese had no idea what was coming for them. The engine roared beneath me like a caged beast, 2,000 horsepower of pure American engineering ready to tear through the Pacific sky. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, and on June 19, 1944, I witnessed the complete annihilation of Japanese naval aviation in what we later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. What I'm about to tell you isn't just the story of a battle. It's the story of how American ingenuity and courage shattered the myth of Japanese air superiority forever. The pre-dawn darkness over Task Force 58 felt different that morning. I'd been flying combat missions for 2 years, first in the old Wildcats that could barely keep up with the nimble Zeros, then transitioning to the new Hellcats that had started arriving in late 1943. But this morning, as I walked across the flight deck of the USS Lexington, I could feel something electric in the air. Admiral Mark Mitcher had assembled the most powerful carrier force in naval history, 15 fast carriers, 7 battleships, and over 900 aircraft. We were about to assault the Mariana Islands, and every pilot knew the Japanese would throw everything they had at us. My Hellcat, tail number 23, sat gleaming under the deck lights. I ran my hand along her wing, feeling the solid construction that had already saved my life twice. Unlike the fragile Zeros that caught fire if you looked at them wrong, the Hellcat was built like a flying tank. 6 50 caliber machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, and armor plating that could take punishment and keep flying. But more than that, she was fast, 380 miles per hour in level flight. Faster than anything the Japanese had in the sky. "Hey, Morrison," called out my wingman, Ensign Tommy Rodriguez. "You ready to bag some more meatballs today?" I grinned and gave him a thumbs up. Tommy was barely 20, fresh out of flight school, but he'd already proven himself in combat over Truk and the Marshall Islands. The kid had ice water in his veins and could outmaneuver pilots with twice his experience. "Just stay on my wing, Rodriguez," I called back. "Today's going to be different. Intelligence says the Japs are massing everything they've got for one final push." Admiral Ozawa's got 9 carriers and every available pilot from shore bases. They're calling it Operation A-Go. As the sun began to rise over the Philippine Sea, the flight deck came alive with organized chaos. Plane handlers pushed aircraft into position while mechanics made final checks. The smell of aviation gasoline mixed with salt air and the acrid smoke from the ship stacks. This was the smell of American naval aviation at its peak. Our squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Mike "Hammer" Hutchinson, gathered us around for the final briefing. Hammer was a veteran of Guadalcanal, one of the few pilots who'd survived those early dark days when we were outnumbered and outgunned. His weathered face bore the 1,000-yard stare of a man who'd seen too much combat, but his voice was steady and confident. "Gentlemen," he began, "today we end Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Our radar pickets have detected massive formations approaching from the west. Conservative estimates put enemy strength at over 400 aircraft. They're coming in 4 waves, and they're bringing everything: Zeros, Vals, Kates, and those new Judys we've been hearing about." He pointed to the tactical board showing our defensive positions. Task Force 58 is spread across 15 miles of ocean. We've got 7 groups of carriers, each with its own combat air patrol. The battle line is positioned to the west. Admiral Lee's fast battleships will handle any surface units that break through. Our job is simple: shoot down every Japanese aircraft before they reach our carriers. The confidence in his voice was infectious. This wasn't the desperate defensive fighting of 1942. This was 1944, and American industrial might had given us the tools for victory. The Hellcat wasn't just superior to the Zero, it was so superior that experienced Japanese pilots were being shot down by American teenagers who'd been flying for 6 months. "One more thing," Hammer continued. "The Japs are using a lot of green pilots. Their experienced aces are mostly dead or grounded due to fuel shortages. What we're facing today are kids with maybe 50 hours of flight time trying to fly combat missions in obsolete aircraft. It's going to be a slaughter, and I want every one of you to come home." As we walked to our aircraft, I thought about how much had changed since Pearl Harbor. In 1942, the Zero had seemed invincible, more maneuverable, longer range, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. American planes were slower, heavier, and our pilots were green. But we'd learned, adapted, and innovated. The Hellcat embodied everything we'd learned about air combat: speed, firepower, and survivability over maneuverability. I climbed into my cockpit and began the pre-flight ritual that had become second nature. Master switch on, mixture rich, prop control high RPM, cowl flaps open. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine turned over with a satisfying rumble, settling into the smooth idle that meant American engineering at its finest. Lexington Control, Theis's Hammer led, requesting permission to launch, came Hammer's voice over the radio. Hammer led, you are cleared for immediate launch. Bandits bearing 270, distance 150 miles, altitude unknown. Vector 250 for intercept. Good hunting. The catapult officer gave me the signal, and I pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat surged down the deck and into the morning sky, climbing steadily into the blue Pacific dawn. Behind me, the rest of Fighting Squadron 16 formed up in perfect four-plane divisions. 36 F6F Hellcats, each carrying enough firepower to destroy a small city. As we climbed through 15,000 feet, the radio crackled with reports from other squadrons. This is Big Blue from Essex. We're seeing multiple bogies on radar, bearing 280, looks like a massive formation. Hornet base to all fighters. Enemy formation estimated at 80-plus aircraft, approaching in multiple waves. My pulse quickened. This was it, the decisive air battle we'd all been training for. The Japanese were betting everything on one massive strike, hoping to cripple our carriers and force us to withdraw. They had no idea what they were flying into. At 10:15 a.m., Lieutenant Chuck Williams in Hellcat 47 made the first visual contact with the enemy formation. His excited voice crackled over the radio. Tally-ho! Tally-ho! Bandits at 2 o'clock high, approximately 60 aircraft, mixed types. I can see Zero's valves in some of those new Judy dive bombers. I looked in the direction Williams indicated and felt my breath catch. The Japanese formation stretched across the sky like a dark cloud, dozens of aircraft in loose formation, heading straight for our task force. Even at 5 miles distance, I could see the distinctive shapes, the pointed nose and greenhouse canopy of the Zero fighters, the fixed landing gear of the Val dive bombers, and the sleek lines of the new Judy bombers that intelligence had warned us about. Hammer lead to all Hammer flights, came our squadron commander's voice. Remember your training. These aren't the experienced pilots from 42. Most of these boys have maybe 50 hours of flight time. Use your speed and altitude advantage. Don't get caught in a turning fight with the Zeros. That was the key to Hellcat tactics. The Zero was still more maneuverable, especially at low speeds, but the Hellcat was faster, could climb better, and was far more durable. Our standard attack was the high-speed pass. Dive down from above, make one firing pass with all 6 .50 caliber machine guns, then use our superior speed to climb back up and reset for another attack. Hammer 2, this is Morrison. I'm taking my division high and left. We'll come down on the fighter escort. Roger, Jack. Tom Inden, I will stay with you. I pushed the throttle forward and climbed to 20,000 feet, positioning myself above and ahead of the Japanese formation. The Zeros were flying at about 15,000 feet, weaving back and forth in a loose combat air patrol pattern. I could see their meatball insignia clearly now, red circles on silver wings that had terrorized Allied pilots for the first 2 years of the war. But this was 1944, not 1942. The pilot in the lead Zero probably had less flight time than I had combat missions. And he was flying an obsolete aircraft against the most advanced fighter in the world. I rolled into a steep dive, building up speed as I closed the distance. The airspeed indicator swept past 350 miles per hour as I lined up on the nearest Zero. At 1,000 yards, I could see the Japanese pilot clearly, young, probably no more than 19, frantically looking around for threats he couldn't see. At 400 yards, I pressed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns erupted in perfect synchronization, sending nearly 5,000 rounds per minute downrange. The Zero's thin aluminum skin might as well have been paper. My tracers walked across the fuselage and into the cockpit. The aircraft disintegrated in a ball of orange flame. "Splash 10," I called out, pulling up into a climbing turn to regain altitude. "Good shooting, Skipper." Tommy's excited voice came over the radio. "I'm going after that Judy on the right." The battle spread across 30 miles of sky as more American squadrons joined the fight. It wasn't really a battle, it was target practice. The Japanese pilots, most of them flying their first combat mission, were completely overwhelmed by the disciplined attacks of experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. I watched Tommy line up on a Judy dive bomber. The Japanese pilot tried to evade, throwing his aircraft into a steep diving turn, but the Hellcat was faster even in a dive. Tommy's burst was perfectly aimed, the Judy's engine exploded in a shower of metal and flame, and the aircraft spun into the ocean below. "That's 2 for Hammer Division," I called out. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Zero was climbing toward me, and I could see the muzzle flashes from his guns. This pilot was different, more experienced. His aircraft was clean and well-maintained, and his tactics showed the kind of training that came from combat experience. He was trying to force me into a turning fight, where the Zero's superior maneuverability would give him the advantage. But I'd been flying Hellcats for 8 months now. I knew my aircraft strengths, and I knew the Zero's weaknesses. Instead of turning with him, I used the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio to climb away from him. The Zero pilot followed, but his aircraft simply couldn't match the Hellcat's climb rate. At 18,000 feet, I had enough altitude advantage to reverse the situation. I rolled into a split S maneuver, diving down behind the climbing Zero. The Japanese pilot saw me coming and tried to turn away, but it was too late. My 6.50 calibers converged on his aircraft from 300 yards away. The Zero's fuel tank, unprotected by self-sealing technology, erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled over and dove toward the ocean, trailing black smoke and burning gasoline. I didn't see a parachute. "Splash another Zero," I reported. "That's 3 for me today." But even as I climbed back to altitude, I could see that the battle was nearly over. Japanese aircraft were falling from the sky all around me, many of them shot down by pilots who were barely out of flight school. The superior training tactics and equipment of American naval aviation had turned what should have been a desperate defensive battle into a one-sided slaughter. By 11:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft had been virtually annihilated. Out of nearly 70 aircraft, fewer than 10 had made it through our fighter screen to attack the carriers, and even those had been intercepted by the close-in combat air patrol. The ocean was littered with burning wreckage and oil slicks marking the graves of Japanese aircrew. "All Hammer flights, this is base," came the voice of the Lexington's fighter director. "Radar shows another large formation approaching from the west. Estimate 120-plus aircraft, multiple types. Vector 280 for intercept." I looked at my fuel gauge, still plenty for another engagement. More importantly, I had nearly 1,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition left. The Hellcat's ammunition capacity was another huge advantage over the Zero, which carried only 60 rounds per gun for its 20mm cannons. "Tommy, how's your fuel and ammo?" "Good to go, Skipper." Still got plenty of both. The second Japanese wave was even larger than the first, but the results were the same. These pilots were even greener than the first wave. Some of them were obviously flying their very first combat mission. I watched one young pilot in a Zero try to dogfight with Lieutenant Mike Anderson from VF-15. Anderson simply extended away from the Zero, climbed to gain altitude advantage, then dove down for a perfect high-side gun pass. The Zero exploded so violently that Anderson had to pull up sharply to avoid flying through the debris. I was lining up on a Val dive bomber when I heard Tommy's voice over the radio. "Skipper, I've got 3 Zeros coming down on us from 4 o'clock high." I looked up and saw them, 3 A6M5 Zeros in a perfect diving attack formation. These pilots were definitely more experienced. Their aircraft were positioned perfectly for a coordinated attack, and they were using the sun to mask their approach. "Break right, Tommy. I'll take the leader." I pulled the Hellcat into a climbing right turn, using the aircraft's superior power to maintain airspeed even in the climb. The lead Zero followed, but I could see he was already losing the energy advantage. The Hellcat's 2,000 horsepower engine was simply too much for the Zero's 1,100 horsepower power plant to match. At the top of the climb, I rolled into a hammerhead stall and came down behind the Zero. The Japanese pilot tried desperately to turn away, but the Hellcat's superior speed gave me the angle I needed. My burst caught him just behind the cockpit, and the Zero broke apart in midair. Tommy had handled his opponent with equal skill, using the Hellcat's superior dive speed to extend away from the Zero's turning attack, then climbing back up for a perfect overhead gun pass. His target went down trailing smoke and flames. The third Zero pilot, seeing his wingman destroyed in a matter of seconds, tried to escape by diving toward the ocean. It was a fatal mistake. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero in level flight, and it was much faster in a dive. I caught up with him at 8,000 feet and fired a long burst into his engine. The Zero's propeller seized, and the aircraft crashed into the ocean in a shower of spray. "That's 6 for me today," I reported. "How many you got, Tommy?" "4 confirmed, maybe 5. Hard to keep track when they're falling this fast." He wasn't exaggerating. The radio was filled with pilots reporting kills. "Splash 1 Judy. Got another 0. 2 Vals going down." The Japanese formations were being decimated by coordinated attacks from multiple squadrons of Hellcats. American pilots with 6 months of training were shooting down Japanese pilots with years of experience, simply because they were flying superior aircraft and using superior tactics. At 1:15 p.m., the third wave appeared on radar, another 80 aircraft heading for our task force. But by now, so many Japanese aircraft had been shot down that we were running out of targets. Some Hellcat pilots were reporting that they couldn't find any enemy aircraft to engage. This wave included several of the new Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, which were supposed to be Japan's answer to the American SBD Dauntless. The Judy was faster than the old Val, with a top speed of over 300 miles per hour, and it carried a larger bomb load. But it was still no match for the Hellcat. I intercepted a formation of 6 Judys at 12,000 feet. They were flying in tight formation, probably hoping that concentrated defensive fire would protect them from fighter attack. It was a tactic that might have worked against the slower, less heavily armed Wildcats. Against the Hellcat, it was suicide. My first pass destroyed the lead bomber, 6. 50 caliber machine guns firing 100 rounds per second was enough firepower to cut a Judy in half. I pulled up, rolled over, and came down on the second bomber. This one caught fire immediately and rolled over into a death spiral. The remaining 4 Judys broke formation and tried to escape, but they were surrounded by Hellcats from 3 different squadrons. None of them made it more than 5 miles before being shot down. By 2 p.m., the Japanese had committed their final reserve, every available aircraft from Admiral Ozawa's carrier force and the land-based squadrons in the Marianas. Intelligence estimated that over 400 Japanese aircraft had been committed to the battle. Our combat air patrol had grown to over 300 Hellcats, with fresh squadrons being launched as others landed to refuel and rearm. What happened next could only be described as a massacre. Japanese pilots, many of them with less than 100 hours of total flight time, were being thrown into combat against American pilots who had been training for 2 years specifically to fight this battle. The Hellcat had been designed from the ground up to kill Zeros, and it showed. I was on my second sortie of the day, having landed to refuel and rearm after shooting down 6 Japanese aircraft in the morning. My wingman was now Lieutenant J.G. Bobby Chen, a Chinese-American pilot from San Francisco who had joined the squadron just 2 months earlier. Despite his inexperience, Bobby had already shot down 3 Japanese aircraft and was proving to be a natural pilot. "Bogies at 11 o'clock low," Bobby called out. "Looks like a mixed formation. Zeros and Kates." The Nakajima B-5 N-Kate torpedo bomber was the aircraft that had devastated Pearl Harbor, but by 1944 it was obsolete and virtually defenseless against modern fighters. The Kate's top speed was only 235 miles per hour, nearly 150 miles per hour slower than the Hellcat. Attacking one was like shooting fish in a barrel. I'll take the fighters, Bobby. You handle the torpedo bombers. I rolled into a high-speed diving attack on the Zero escorts. There were 4 of them, flying in a loose weave pattern about 1,000 feet above the torpedo bombers. The lead pilot saw me coming and tried to turn into my attack, but the Hellcat's speed advantage was insurmountable. My burst caught his Zero in the engine, and the aircraft immediately began trailing white smoke, probably coolant from a punctured radiator. The Zero pilot tried to maintain altitude, but his engine was already overheating. Within 30 seconds, the aircraft was trailing black smoke and losing altitude rapidly. The second Zero tried to escape by diving toward the ocean, but that played right into the Hellcat's strengths. I followed him down, easily matching his dive speed, and caught up with him at 5,000 feet. My guns tore through his aircraft's thin skin, and the Zero exploded in a ball of fire. Meanwhile, Bobby was systematically destroying the Kate formation. The torpedo bombers were so slow and unmaneuverable that attacking them was more like gunnery practice than aerial combat. Bobby's first target simply disintegrated under the concentrated fire of 6 .50 caliber machine guns. The second Kate tried to escape by flying at wave-top level, but Bobby followed him down and finished him off with a short burst from close range. "That's 2 Kates down," Bobby reported, going after the third one. But there was no need. Lieutenant Williams from my old division had already claimed the third Kate, and fourth had been shot down by a pilot from the Hornets Air Group. In less than 3 minutes, an entire Japanese torpedo bomber squadron had been wiped out. The radio chatter told the same story all across the battle area. "Got 3 Zeros over here. 4 Vals going down. I can't find any more targets." Japanese aircraft were falling from the sky so fast that American pilots were having trouble finding fresh targets to engage. At 2:45 p.m., I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A lone Japanese aircraft flying at high altitude, well above the main battle. It was a Nakajima C6 and Mert reconnaissance plane, probably trying to get photographs of our task force disposition for future attacks. The Mert was fast, nearly as fast as the Hellcat, and it was flown by an obviously experienced pilot. As I climbed to intercept, the Japanese aircraft began a series of evasive maneuvers that showed real skill. This wasn't some green kid on his first mission. This was a veteran pilot who knew exactly what he was doing. I pushed the Hellcat to its maximum climb rate, using every bit of the R2800's 2,000 horsepower to gain altitude. The Mert pilot saw me coming and began a shallow dive to build up speed, but he made one crucial mistake. He turned toward our task force instead of away from it. That turn gave me the angle I needed. I rolled into a high-side gun pass, coming down on the Mert from above and behind. The Japanese pilot tried to evade, throwing his aircraft into a series of violent maneuvers, but the Hellcat's superior firepower was decisive. My burst tore through the Mert's fuselage and into the cockpit. The aircraft rolled over and spun into the ocean. "Splash 1 Mert," I reported. "That's 7 for me today." But even as I spoke, I could see that the battle was winding down. The sky, which had been filled with dozens of aircraft just an hour earlier, was now almost empty. Here and there, isolated Japanese aircraft were still trying to reach our carriers, but they were being intercepted and destroyed by fresh squadrons of Hellcats. By 3:30 p.m., Admiral Ozawa's carrier strike force had been virtually annihilated. Of the 373 aircraft he had launched that morning, fewer than 30 would make it back to their carriers. Many of those that did return were so badly damaged that they would never fly again. Japanese naval aviation, built up over decades of training and combat experience, had been destroyed in a single afternoon. But the Japanese weren't finished yet. Intelligence reports indicated that Admiral Kakuta's land-based aircraft from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian were being readied for a final desperate attack. These were the last reserves, training aircraft, obsolete fighters, and anything else that could carry a bomb or torpedo. At 4:15 p.m., radar detected the final wave, 50 aircraft approaching from the northeast. These weren't the relatively modern aircraft of the carrier force. These were a mixture of obsolete types that the Japanese had scraped together from training units and reserve squadrons. I was on my third sortie of the day, flying with a scratch division made up of pilots from 3 different squadrons. My fuel was getting low, and I was down to my last 200 rounds of ammunition. But the adrenaline of combat was still pumping through my veins. "There they are," called out Lieutenant Sam Houston from VF-27. "Mixed bag of everything. Looks like some old Claude fighters, a few Nels, and what might be some trainer aircraft." The Mitsubishi A5M Claude was the Zero's predecessor, a fixed landing gear fighter that had been obsolete since 1940. The Mitsubishi G3M Nel was a twin-engine bomber that was so slow and lightly defended that it was essentially a flying coffin. That the Japanese were committing such obsolete aircraft to combat showed just how desperate their situation had become. "All right, gentlemen," I called out. "Let's finish this. These boys are probably flying on fumes, and half their aircraft are held together with prayer and baling wire. Make it quick and clean." The Claude fighters tried to provide cover for the bombers, but they were so outclassed that the engagement was over almost before it began. My Hellcat was nearly twice as fast as the Claude, and my 6.50 caliber machine guns had more firepower than an entire squadron of the obsolete Japanese fighters. My first target was a Claude that was trying to climb to altitude. The Japanese pilot was clearly experienced. His aircraft handling showed the kind of skill that came from years of flying, but he was flying an aircraft that belonged in a museum. My first burst tore through the Claude's engine, and the aircraft began trailing smoke. The pilot tried to maintain altitude, but his engine was already failing. Within seconds, the Claude was spinning toward the ocean. Lieutenant Houston engaged a formation of 3 Nel bombers with devastating effect. The Nels were so slow that Houston could easily outrun them, then turn around and attack from any angle he chose. His first pass destroyed the lead bomber, and his second pass crippled a second Nel so badly that it crashed into the ocean before Houston could line up for a third attack. The final Nel tried to escape by diving toward the water, but Lieutenant Rodriguez from my old squadron caught up with it at wave-top level. The bomber exploded so violently that Rodriguez had to pull up sharply to avoid flying through the debris. By 5 p.m., it was over. The last Japanese aircraft had either been shot down or had fled back toward their bases. The ocean for miles around was littered with wreckage, bits of aluminum, life rafts, oil slicks, and debris marking the graves of hundreds of Japanese aircrew. Task Force 58 had achieved something unprecedented in naval history: the complete destruction of an enemy's carrier-based air power in a single day. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft that had attacked our task force, only 29 made it back to their carriers. American losses were 29 aircraft, most of them to operational accidents rather than enemy action. As I trapped aboard the Lexington that evening, my hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. I had flown 3 combat sorties totaling over 6 hours of flight time, and I had shot down 9 Japanese aircraft, more than many pilots would claim in their entire combat careers. The flight deck was buzzing with activity as aircraft landed and pilots compared notes on the day's action. The normal post-mission tension was replaced by an almost carnival atmosphere. Pilots were laughing, joking, and recounting their victories with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for football victories. 9 kills. "Morrison," called out Commander Hutchinson as I climbed down from my Hellcat. "That ties you with Dave McCampbell for the squadron record." I looked back at my aircraft. Hellcat number 23, the machine that had carried me through one of the most decisive air battles in history. The aircraft was unmarked except for a few small holes from Japanese machine gun fire. The armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks had done their job perfectly. "How many total for the squadron, Skipper?" I asked. 47 confirmed kills, probably 50 or more when we get all the gun camera film developed. And we didn't lose a single pilot. That was the real story of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, not just the lopsided kill ratio, but the fact that American pilots were returning safely from missions that would have been suicidal just 2 years earlier. The Hellcat hadn't just given us air superiority, it had given us air supremacy. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the sounds of the carrier preparing for the next day's operations, I thought about what we had accomplished. In a single day, we had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Ozawa's 9 carriers were now floating airfields with no aircraft to fly from them. The experienced pilots who had terrorized Allied forces from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea were dead, shot down by American teenagers flying superior aircraft. But more than that, we had proven something fundamental about American industrial might and training methods. The Hellcat wasn't just a better aircraft than the Zero, it was the product of a completely different approach to warfare. Where the Japanese had focused on producing a small number of elite pilots flying lightweight, maneuverable aircraft, we had focused on mass production of both pilots and aircraft, emphasizing survivability and firepower over pure performance. The numbers told the story. In 1944, American factories were producing over 2,000 aircraft per month. Japanese production was less than 500 per month and falling. American flight training programs were graduating 1,500 pilots per month with an average of 300 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Japanese programs were producing maybe 300 pilots per month with less than 100 hours of training. The Hellcat embodied this industrial approach to warfare. It wasn't the most maneuverable fighter in the sky, but it was fast, heavily armed, and virtually indestructible. More importantly, it was easy to fly and forgiving of pilot errors, qualities that allowed relatively inexperienced pilots to engage veteran enemies on equal terms. As I drifted off to sleep, I could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines as the night fighters took off for their patrol stations. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove American superiority in the air. But tonight, we could rest knowing that we had won the most decisive air battle in naval history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than just a tactical victory. It was the moment when American naval aviation came of age. We had taken the best that Japanese aviation could throw at us and destroyed it completely. From this day forward, American carriers would operate with virtual impunity in the Pacific, and Japanese admirals would have to plan their operations knowing that they could not count on air cover. 3 days later, as Task Force 58 continued its assault on the Mariana Islands, I found myself thinking about the Japanese pilots we had shot down. They had been brave men, fighting for their country just as we were fighting for ours. Many of them had died in obsolete aircraft, sent into battle by commanders who knew they had little chance of survival. The mathematics of the Turkey Shoot were staggering. In a single day, the Japanese had lost 395 aircraft and experienced aircrew members who represented years of training and combat experience. American losses were 29 aircraft and 27 aircrew, a kill ratio of better than 14-1. But the real significance of the battle wasn't in the numbers. It was in what those numbers represented. Japanese naval aviation would never recover from the losses suffered on June 19, 1944. The experienced pilots, the irreplaceable veterans of Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and the early Pacific campaigns were gone forever. Their replacements would be teenage boys with minimal training, flying against American pilots who were getting better trained and better equipped every month. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet would continue to exist on paper, but it would never again be an effective fighting force. The carriers that had once terrorized the Pacific were now little more than floating targets, their flight decks empty and their hangars silent. For American naval aviation, the Turkey Shoot marked the beginning of total air dominance in the Pacific. From this point forward, American carriers could operate wherever they chose, supporting amphibious assaults and conducting deep strikes against Japanese bases with virtual impunity. The Hellcat had proven itself to be everything its designers had promised: fast, heavily armed, well protected, and deadly in the hands of properly trained pilots. By the end of the war, Hellcats would account for 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, more than any other Allied fighter. The aircraft's kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1 remains one of the best in aviation history. But perhaps most importantly, the Turkey Shoot demonstrated the effectiveness of American training methods and industrial capacity. We had taken farm boys and city kids, given them 300 hours of flight training and a superior aircraft, and turned them into pilots who could consistently defeat veteran enemies. This was America's way of war, not individual heroics, but systematic application of superior resources, training, and technology. As I write this account 50 years later, I can still remember the sound of my Hellcat's engine starting up that morning, the feel of the controls as I rolled into my first attack, and the satisfaction of watching another Zero fall in flames. But I also remember the young faces of the Japanese pilots I shot down, boys who died far from home in a war that was already lost. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was a complete American victory, achieved at minimal cost in American lives. It demonstrated the superiority of American aircraft, training, and tactics. But it was also a reminder of the terrible cost of war, even for the victors. On June 19, 1944, American naval aviation achieved total air superiority in the Pacific. The Hellcat had proven its lethal superiority beyond any doubt, and Japanese pilots had learned too late that the age of zero dominance was over. The path to Tokyo lay open, and American carriers would lead the way. The war was far from over, but after the Turkey Shoot, its outcome was no longer in doubt. American industrial might, superior training, and technological innovation had combined to create an unstoppable force in the Pacific. The Hellcat was the spearhead of that force, and on June 19, 1944, it had written one of the most decisive chapters in the history of naval aviation. As the sun set over Task Force 58 that evening, painting the Pacific sky in shades of orange and red, I knew I had witnessed something historic. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot would go down in history as the day American naval aviation achieved total dominance over its enemies. And the F6F Hellcat would be remembered as the weapon that made that dominance possible. The Japanese had learned the hard way that the Hellcat's lethal superiority was no myth. It was cold, hard reality, delivered at 380 miles per hour with a concentrated firepower of 6.50 caliber machine guns. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, that reality had come as a fatal shock. For American naval aviation, it was the beginning of an era of unprecedented dominance that would carry us all the way to Tokyo Bay.